Jiden and Shle. My Idashkiji Bashashin Floka Dawan Dashache. My name is Manasseh Begay, and I am White Mountain Apache and Navajo. I come from my White Mountain Apache side is my mother's side, where my clan over there is the Bear Clan. And my Navajo side is Ma'idashkiji, which is the Coyote Pass clan. It's good to see all of your smiling faces here today, and glad you can make it here. Just wanted to give you a little background on bringing in our speaker here today. Is we have a grant with the Booter Center, the Catherine M. Booter Center for Native American Studies. It's called our SAGE grant, which is Social Workers Advancing in Grounded Education. And the goal of this grant is really to get more social workers working with our Native American communities out there in the world. And so we provide some financial assistance to them to get them out there, but we also provide training for some of our sites out there, some of our students, some of our faculty, staff, all that deal. And that's what allowed us to bring out Jennifer here. So just a little bit of where this is all coming from. We hope you get a lot out of this, but I'm going to introduce our speakers so I can give her the amount of time that she needs to talk on this subject. This is going to be Jennifer S. Nanez. She is a licensed master social worker who currently serves as a lecturer at the University of New Mexico Division of Community Behavioral Health in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. Man, it's a lot of words there. Ms. Nanez is an enrolled tribal member of the Pueblo of Acoma in New Mexico. Ms. Nanez has been in the social work and educational field for over 25 years, with experience working across tribal, urban, Indian, federal, and university systems, all with an emphasis in serving the Native American populations. Ms. Nanez's interests lie in suicide prevention and mental health treatment support. Her works promote effective community engagement and clinical practice, while emphasizing cultural resilience, connection to traditions, and indigenous-based knowledge and healing in Native American tribes and communities. She is a daughter, sister, and auntie, and the mother of two young indigenous matriarchs in training. We're happy to introduce Jennifer Nanez as our SAGE speaker today for her talk titled Understanding Historical Trauma and Intergenerational Trauma to Create Culturally Safe Care for American Indian and Alaska Natives.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So, ang kwazi kay tao hapa, ang tushinamen ads aya yakukuch and shita Americana washti shida. So my name is Jennifer Nanez. I'm from the Pueblo of Acoma. I'm really thrilled to be here with you today. I'm Yellow Corn Clan from the Pueblo of Acoma. I'm also biracial. My father's from the Mississippi area. He grew up out there and has been in New Mexico, though, the majority of his life on reservation with us. So I would say Americana Washti, which means I'm recognizing him on my father's side, my baby clan side, as just gonna say it, the white guy. But I love him. He's a wonderful human being. He's worked in tribal communities all his life. And I'm thrilled to be his daughter and be here with you all today. So I also wanted to add one other qualifier in my bio. You forgot to add deadly auntie. Hey. That is now my latest title, and apparently the title of my fantasy basketball team with my nephew. So I wanted to start off first here again today to thank you for allowing me to be with you. This topic area that we've been asked to speak on is really near and dear to my heart, in part because it's something that has resonated with me since I was an MSW and a BSW student. And for my work in my community and in other tribal communities, my work has always been within tribal populations. It really helped me to understand a lot of what we face within our communities, and also even spoke to me as an individual in what I saw happening within my own family. So this was incredibly helpful as a concept, but as we're moving through this, and as we've grown and I've grown over time, thinking about how do we work with this within our communities and how do we move through this process of healing from historical trauma. So I wanted to first start off with, again, the land acknowledgement here. Of course, Brown School of Social Work and here Washington University in St. Louis does have their land acknowledgement. And I'm really thrilled to be here again today on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Osage Nation, Oto, Missouri, Illinois Confederacy, Quapaw, Ho-Chunk, and Miami, and many other tribes who are the custodians of this land where we reside and where we call home. I want to challenge you all to think, though, wherever you are today, wherever you sit here, anywhere across this continent, that is indigenous land. And again, where I come from, in my community, where I live, New Mexico is our current boundary. So I come from the state of New Mexico, where it serves as the current boundary for 23 tribes at the time. And again, remembering to think about how those lands were never ceded. They're still ours traditionally, and our sovereignty has never been ceded. It's been recognized in many areas across the nation and through federal recognition, but it was never, again, given up. So wherever you are, again, we want to acknowledge that space. We also want to acknowledge this land itself, our mother, our two-legged, our four-legged, winged ones, and ones that swim, and all of the creatures that reside on this earth for their caretaking of us and their nourishment of us and their blessing of us that they provide us daily. So when we think about land acknowledgements too, not only again in thinking about our indigenous peoples who sat here before, the land that we still occupy, but our earth itself, recognizing our earth and its caretaking of us. So before I begin, I always like to be grounded in the space that I am in. And for me, it's always helpful to have, again, some reminders of home. So this is where I come from. If you've never been to the Pueblo of Acoma, again, it's one of 19 pueblos in New Mexico, one of 23 tribes in total. We're called the Sky City in part because we reside on top of a 400-foot mesa, much like Hopi and our Hopi relatives. And this is a view from the bottom near where I live. And from the top looking down onto my house, I'm right past that singular little structure, sandstone mesa there called Lonesome Rock. And this is where I live and where I work from when I'm home and when I'm not residing in Albuquerque, which is my other workspace. And in terms of academia, working with the University of New Mexico, of course, we're always required to disclose. So I have no financial or commercial disclosure for this presentation today. And we have a few learning objectives that we're going to walk through today, in part because when we're coming into this space to do education, we want to ensure that we're touching on key areas and concepts that we're wanting to convey. So the first of which is going to analyze the traumatizing effects of key historical events and federal governmental policies regarding our population, the American Indian and Alaska Native population. We'll talk about the impact of stress and trauma on our health, including epigenetic change. We'll talk a little bit about how do we translate core values of trauma-informed care to clinical care for American Indian youth and families, and talking about defining cultural safety. And that's where I want to spend some time today, because that concept that we've been working off in our area, and really it's a global concept that the US is only now beginning to visit, is something that again resonates with our work, especially in tribal communities. So again, thank you for allowing me to be here. I want to though give our acknowledgement to Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart for all of her work in this area. She's our esteemed elder and faculty member at the University of New Mexico. We're thrilled to be able to work with her on a day-to-day basis. Both she and Dr. Josie Trace are really, again, the creators and originators of this concept of historical trauma in our tribal communities. And so we're grateful to be able to have her mentorship and support. So before we begin, I want to take a look at this photo here. If you're not familiar with this photo, this was a recent photo that has surfaced in media around footprints that were found at White Sands that date back at least 25,000 years ago. and really in some way have upset the thinking of when man was first discovered in this region. And when we think about these footprints here, these are ours. These are our indigenous footprints. These are who we are, where we were all that time ago. And so this concept of we were a people before we, the people, is very relevant, because we were a people long before the idea of the United States, because the US is an idea. It's a concept that doesn't always have to be permanent. We were idea before Spanish government, before Mexican government in our region. And we had long migration routes, cosmology, medicine, science, healthcare within our communities during that time of pre-colonization. So when we think about our existence, this time frame that we are in right now is still a very short time frame. Yet it's had profound impact on our tribal population and our tribal peoples. And when you think about American Indian history overall, when you hear us talking about it, not only in academia, but in other settings, you'll hear us define it in terms of eras of time, in part because those eras have been defined by, again, entry into our region with colonization, so pre-colonization, post-colonization. And then you see in this timeline, we jump far ahead into American governmental rule, in part because these are policies that still impact us today, frameworks that impact us today, even in the present day. So let's talk a little bit about these eras that we walk through. Again, of course, pre-colonization, that was our period of existence on this continent, and again, even into South America prior to European arrival. We had trade routes, like I mentioned, from here all the way into South America. I, again, come from the Pueblo of Acoma. We're located in the southwestern region of New Mexico, but we have a parrot clan. Are there parrots in New Mexico? No. We use abalone shell regularly in our ceremonies and traditions. Are we anywhere near an ocean? No. But these were long established trade routes. And so when we think about our existence, we think about, again, that mass travel that we did during that time frame, exploration during that time frame. But when, again, colonization came in, we saw that it began to shift where we could go. And again, it moved us into subjugation as a population. And as we moved into American governmental rule, we started seeing issues of removal, assimilation, reorganization, termination, and even our present day period, which we call the self-determination era. And every single one of these had impacts. Again, that early colonization was that mass subjugation. It was a huge shift in our worldview. There were suddenly these outsiders who were coming in with ill intention into our spaces, right? Removal was an era of time that was again created in the American history, but removal was already happening really from colonization on. But that era in time as defined here was defined by an actual removal policy signed by President Andrew Jackson. And again, we saw mass land loss during that time, mass loss of population, genocide, disease, and reservation systems were being established at that time. Assimilation too was another majorly impactful period of time for us. And we're going to spend some time on this in particular. And this was a true attempt at eradicating our identity, but using education as a tool to do so. And so when we think about our relationship with education, it is very complex, in part because education was meant originally to assimilate and eradicate us. And so we have to examine where are we in relation to education today even. Reorganization was governmental imposition. It changed for many of us those traditional governmental structures, administrative structures, oversight structures that we had traditionally within our communities. And tribes could opt in, tribes could opt out. I come from a community where we still have a traditional form of government We have one religious clan in our community that appoints leadership on a yearly basis. It's completely outside of any democratic, quote unquote, forms or systems of nominating leadership. Yet our closest relative, the Pueblo of Laguna, who is literally at our border, has a democratic form of government and a constitution, in part because of that policy of reorganization. Termination, that was another period of time and another mass impact, in part because 109 tribes were subjected to termination, a policy that said you are no longer an Indian tribe, you are no longer Indian people, you are just individuals and families. And of course, during that time, we saw again a mass land scoop happening at that time. And again, loss of tribal identity. And it took for our tribes all the way up until the last presidential period for the last of those 109 tribes to be recognized. So again, over 50, nearly 60 years to fight for recognition. And we're sitting in this present day of self-determination. And even in this time frame, we're still seeing challenges to our sovereignty, challenges to our environmental activism, challenges to our children through, again, those challenges to the Indian Child Welfare Act, for example, research abuses, educational abuses still within our communities, healthcare disparities. But it's also a time of cultural revitalization where we're moving into the space of healing from historical trauma. And this is what's amazing about this current and present day era that we're sitting in. So let's go and take a little bit of time to spin in this avenue in what we're calling confronting the trauma. So now we're going to begin to move into this concept again of what is historical trauma. And to do so, we have to visit history. So we've talked a little bit about that timeline here. And again, thinking about jumping far ahead into US rule. For the community I come from, the United States is actually our third governmental system that we've been through. We were through Mexican independence in governmental rule, Spanish independence in governmental rule for a number of centuries, and then, of course, our own. And so this time frame that we're sitting in, again, that impact is, we've moved far ahead already in our timeline, because if we were to spend time visiting all of those impacts up until this time here, we would be here for semesters upon semesters, right? Talking about each individual impact in our communities and across the nation. It's a different nation to nation for our population. So when we think about, again, our population, as many as 15 million people, indigenous people, lived in the North American continent at the time of Western entry. But by the close of the 19th century, fewer than 300,000 American Indians remained, in part because of these policies, because of genocide, because of war, because of removal. And that removal policy, again, was very intentional. It moved tribes west originally from the East Coast that were remaining. And again, a reminder that many of those tribes on the East were decimated nearly to extinction, in part because of Western entry, and moved them into spaces in the West. And then we also began to see movement of the West Coast off into the Midwest. So where you see our population sitting now, for many of our tribes, those are not our original homelands. The exception being the Pueblos. Believe it or not, our Pueblo communities in New Mexico sit on the original lands where we finally settled over the course of time. And it was actually Spanish recognition, because we were under Spanish rule, that allowed us to stay there through Mexican rule and then even into US rule. And to this day, we still call on some of those legal challenges from Spanish time frame to maintain our land base. When we look at pictures though like this, it gives you the idea again of what was happening. This is again our Dene Nation, our Navajo Nation, under guard at Fort Sumner. And for us locally in our region, again, the Navajo population and Apache nations were rounded up as part of removal era policies all the way into the 1860s to begin to move them off reservation and try again to scoop up land base. So these removal eras had lots of impact again on land loss, population loss, disease, and again, that trauma as part of that removal. Moving into the boarding school era, again, you can see us jumping ahead already through our timeline. In the part of that removal era itself was again to come into removing our population. And part of that removal was removing leadership from tribal communities in an effort to break up fighting back. And again, to break our tribal communities as a whole. So an example of this happened right before this time frame, and it was again during this transition where many tribal leaders were being incarcerated and interred at Fort Marion, Florida. And at that time, there was a lieutenant, he later became a captain, later became a colonel. His name was Richard Henry Pratt. And what he began to do in his time there at Fort Marion was to work with that population who were interred there, Apache, Osage, and others who were there, and begin teaching, reading, writing. And the idea bloomed in his mind that if we begin to work on education with this population, we can begin to assimilate them into the broader dominant culture. Not to mention, it was cheaper to educate our population than to continue to fight multiple wars and fund multiple militaries. So this idea gave way to the boarding school and what was now known as the boarding school era. And so in the late 1860s, this movement began, and that primary proponent was Colonel Richard Henry Pratt, by this time a colonel. And his motto became kill the Indian and save the man. And again, that motto was to again illustrate that idea of eradicating the Indian identity, separating them from their community. And so the first governmental school was established, Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania in 1879. Now, other notable schools quickly popped up. Chilocco Indian School, Albuquerque Indian School, which is how, where I work and play off of is Indian School Road in Albuquerque. Chamawa Indian School in Oregon, still in operation. Santa Fe Indian School in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is still in operation. Sherman Indian School in California, which is also still in operation. And the impact of this is by 1926, 83% of all American children were being removed from their family, their parents, grandparents, extended family, their tribal community, their environment, and being placed in these residential school settings. So let's take a look at some of those children here. You can see here in this photo, several children there at the front of the main building, the main house in Carlisle. And Colonel Richard Henry Pratt is there. He's right near the center, near the doorway. That's him, overseeing the students at that time frame. Now, what's also notable is beyond governmental schools, religious schools quickly jumped on the bandwagon. And over 14 different denominations began creating mission schools in this same framework across the United States. So this is my school here, St. Catherine's Indian School. So I'm a fourth generation boarding school alumni. Now, I hear the term a lot when we talk about boarding school around boarding school descendant. I'm not a descendant, I'm an alumni. Or boarding school survivor. Well, some days I say, yeah, I survived. And while my experience was probably very different from the origination of this policy, it's still very much part of our present. So when we think about these, again, spaces, all of these different denominations jumped on board. And again, removing children for this assimilation policy, but also to save our souls, to convert us. And so for many of our tribal communities, you'll see more affiliation depending on the type of school that they had in their region or area or where they were sent. So for example, again, part of our Pueblo communities, yes, because of Spanish governmental rule, still well connected to traditional Catholic calendars and traditional Catholicism. And so many of us attended Catholic boarding schools. But they all differ, again, as you can see, Presbyterian, Quaker, Episcopal, Mennonite, Dutch Reform, Evangelical, Protestant. My daughter right now is at a Protestant residential school, but it's also a day school. It's called Minal in Albuquerque. And we're probably also familiar with this famous photo before and after Mr. Tom Torlino. And we see this utilized to really illustrate that intent of this policy to, again, eradicate that Indian identity, make them look like us, make them act like us, change that image physically as well as mentally and spiritually. This is Mr. Torlino with his group at entry. And you can see he is seated here on the bottom left with his group. Now, I'm also happy to share that I know Mr. Torlino's great-granddaughter, and she shared with me after attending one of our presentations and talks, and she's a social worker, that her grandfather, after his time at Carlisle, did return back to the reservation and actually became a medicine person in his community. And for me, that was so wonderful to know that accumulation of his story, right? That return. Now, this was a far-reaching policy. These are children who were also taken to Carlisle, who were at that time considered quote, quote, Eskimo children, as they were called, Alaska Native children. And so they were taking, again, all the way from that homeland across the country to Carlisle, Pennsylvania for school. And you can see these children here a few years later. Closer to home for me, the Albuquerque Indian School was established around that same time frame, around 1887, I believe. And my school was in 1885. In this particular photo, what do you observe? What do you see here? What are they wearing? Shout it out. Military? Yep. Mm-hmm. What do you notice about their hair? Cut, it's shorn, very short. And what do you think the role is of this slightly older child there in the middle? What was his role? He was the leader, the disciplinarian, right, of the group. So these school systems were created often in these militarized structures, right? We have children, well, we have elders, I should say, who now recall their time frame still being in regiments, right? Being a part of a regimented system. And again, in this space that you see here, again, oftentimes older children were being placed in charge of younger children, pitting children against children, essentially, and putting them in that space and role of disciplinarian, and often having to mete out punishment to younger children in their charge. Now, we saw earlier Mr. Torlino's group, and you're seeing again the group that also came from the Alaska area. Many of those youth were what we would call late adolescents and even early adults, right? When we think about them in this time frame. Well, that was also the challenge, was in part because when Carlisle and these governmental school systems started, they first again identified older youth, young adults as part of that educational system. But they quickly found, like Mr. Torlino, that these children were returning to their communities, returning to their tradition, returning to their language, and leaving behind this assimilation. So the drive was to begin looking at younger children. How old do you think these children are here? About 4 or 5? Yep. Yes. So they began scooping up children younger and younger. In fact, at Haskell, you can find records of infants who were taken into their charge and raised there essentially the entirety of their lifetime. In Albuquerque Indian School, there was a exhibit there several years back that had many of the roles displayed, children as young as 4 being removed. Now, quick question, how many of you may have children that age or grandchildren that age? Nieces or nephews? Yeah, and can you imagine that? Imagine them not being in your care. Imagine not knowing where they are, not knowing how they're being treated. So we think about the trauma to the child, but we also have to think about the trauma to the family, the system, the community, right? Because those children were being removed from their environments. And it was not voluntary either in its original framework. This is a group of Hopi men who were imprisoned in Alcatraz Island off the coast of California. Now, one, if you're familiar with where Hopi is, Hopi sits like us on top of a mesa, several different mesas, in the middle of the desert in Arizona. Now, we pray for rain, we pray for water, but can you imagine being in prison on an island surrounded by probably the most water they'd ever seen in their life, and then confined to a dungeon under that space for over 1.5 years for their refusal to send their youth? And there are photos that show these gentlemen here being rounded up in Hopi. Photographers captured that. And you can see the community looking on as they're being marched through the village. And when we say it was not voluntary too, beyond, again, that treatment of the parents, families, was the treatment of the children. These are baby handcuffs from Haskell Indian Archives that were returned recently, actually, the last decade or so, by a family member who had, again, ancestry who worked at this school. In jails that were created there on campuses, guard houses as they were referred to, for the incorrigible students. Those children who tried to run away, those children who acted out, those children who fought back. And when we think again about this space of trauma, many of them were acting out from that space of trauma, right? That desire to return home, to be in safety. But again, instead, they were subjected to imprisonment or internment. So Carlisle Indian School is a really interesting school in that in this day and age, they have a digital resource center as part of Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And you can see many of these photos come from that site. It's a searchable resource center, and you can search by tribe. You can search by keywords, different keywords, including discipline. And this particular one popped up for me recently as I was working on this. And it's a letter of complaint from a teacher regarding the treatment of children in Carlisle Indian School. And you can see here, she's arguing with, of all folks, in her letter, Theodore Roosevelt, the future president of the United States at this time. And she writes, "My time will not expire according to law and justice until the 19th of December. And so that portion here, when you read the entirety of the letter in full, was because she was being dismissed for this particular complaint. And she says, "Yet, because I've succeeded in ferreting out this great system of show here and know the petty tyranny and meanness, injustice and wrong, the consequences which follow from the punishment of keeping the children on a diet of bread and water for 1 to 2 weeks and flinging them into cold cells until they are chilled to the heart, so that many cases of death have resulted from pneumonia and consumption, all in the beautiful cause of breaking their wills and humbling their pride and crushing out all manhood and womanhood in the barbarity of stringing boys up by their thumbs until the nervous system received a shock from which they've never recovered to the full use of their faculties. This type of treatment, unfortunately, we know was very common in many of our school systems that we were subjected to. And again, this letter was written by Adele Rankin at that time, who was an instructor at Carlisle. She sent this off to Theodore Roosevelt, then the commissioner for the U.S. Civil Service Commission in 1892. And here's his response. He forwarded it on to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, because in part, Commissioner for Indian Affairs was over us, our overseer and oversight. And he writes, "Dear Sir, the enclosed letter complaining of alleged abuses at the Carlisle Indian School, with which this commission, of course, has nothing to do with whatsoever. I have the honor to turn it over to you." Now, we also know, again, President Roosevelt's treatment of us later on, right? Within our communities. And I imagine some of this was informed by his history in these positions. So those children, again, in terms of that treatment, often didn't survive. So this is Carlisle Indian School Graveyard, 1885. Reminder that the school was established only 6 years earlier, 1879. And multiple children from multiple different tribes perished here and are interred here. And now many of our tribal communities are working on repatriating their remains. In fact, the most recent of which were two children who were repatriated back to their home community in actually the last few months or so. And this abusive treatment, of course, for many of our population was pretty well known. We knew about this American Indian boarding school history. And for many of us, like myself, we were still enrolling in boarding schools. We were still being sent to boarding schools within our communities. Yet it's interesting to note that when the news broke nationally about the Kamloops finding in Kamloops, British Columbia, of 215 unmarked graves of children, that there was this aha moment. Oh my gosh. How could this be true? What did Canada do to their Indigenous population? When in truth, that policy originated here in the United States and then was picked up in Canada. It was picked up in Australia, working with the Aboriginal population, and in other countries, and replicated across those countries and how they dealt with Indigenous or Aboriginal people. And later, is our understanding, it became the impetus for the Nazi internment camps. So right now, what you see is our Secretary Holland, who is a member of the Pueblo of Laguna, our sister Pueblo, and again, as Secretary of Indian Affairs, has initiated a study of these American Indian boarding schools across the United States. And in 2021, a report was issued noting at least 400 and some odd boarding schools across the United States that were governmentally funded, including some religious schools like my own. I was really shocked to find my school on that list, in part because it received federal funding to be in existence. I never knew that until that moment. And in this space now is conducting a listening tour across the United States to hear alumni and survivors' testimony about their experience during the boarding schools. So as I mentioned, I'm fourth generation boarding school. I went to boarding school, I graduated. I won't tell you when, date me. Still a deadly auntie though. I had my mother attend boarding schools, in fact, multiple boarding schools. She was in Kentucky at one point, up in Fruitland, New Mexico, near Shiprock, and finally graduated out in Arizona. So she went several different places. My grandmother and my grandfather attended Albuquerque Indian School. My grandfather ran away and then joined the military and fought in World War II. And my great-grandfather, my mother's grandfather, was taken at the age of 6 to Chilocco. So we talk about the impact of that in part because you see what it did to our communities and to our family, that separation. And what we saw also was mass land grab by universities and school systems during that time frame. And for us, tradition loss, language loss. So while I'm thrilled to be able to introduce myself and my language, it's taken me all these years to get to that space to be able to do that. And in our own family, my mother and her cousin are probably the last two fluent speakers of our Keres language in our immediate family. And that came from a dictate from our great-grandfather. When the grandchildren were being born, beyond the two oldest, he said, I want them to do well in school. So I want them to only understand or learn English. And it's now in our adulthood, and even now for our children and grandchildren, that we're having to reteach the language and relearn the language. And that's exactly what that policy was meant to do, is to separate us from that. And we're working on it even at this time frame. So I wanted to share a little bit about my path with you on that, because this is my present. It's not just my history. So now let's jump forward here a little bit more in our timeline. Think about our military involvement. So right around this time frame in 1940s or so, we saw the beginning of World War II. And during this time, over 44,000 American Indians enlisted, like my grandfather, and again fought during this time frame. And what we see is roughly 5 to almost 10% of the American Indian population at that time fought in World War II, including over 800 American Indian women who were in the military. But this history of military involvement is not new. In fact, over 12,000 American Indians fought in World War I. And a reminder that we didn't even receive citizenship until 1924. So we weren't even citizens at that time frame, yet we were still defending our land because this is still indigenous land. And this is part of the impetus for us, again, continuing our representation in the military to this day. In fact, we have the highest percentage by ethnicity participation in the military. Any ethnic group, any ethnic group. Let me repeat that again, any ethnic group. The highest percentage. And so we've had, again, our population fight in Korea and Vietnam, and since the Gulf War, more than 24,000 have served. And post 9/11, almost 19% of all American Indians and Alaska Natives have served in the armed forces. It's nearly 1/5 of our entire population. Now, when we came out of that war, we came home, our veterans came home, but we're still not allowed to vote. And in New Mexico, it took Miguel Trujillo, who was a World War II veteran and a member of the Pueblo of Isleta, who sued the state of New Mexico for the right to vote. I fought for my country. I should be able to vote for my leadership. And thankfully he won. And so for American Indians in New Mexico, we've had the right to vote since 1948. We're coming up on 75 years of having the right to vote. Yet for our American Indian population, again, across the nation, it wasn't codified until the Indian Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act again, and Voting Rights Act in the 60s. So we're privileged in a way in our state, in part because we have been active since this time frame. And one other story to share with you really quickly. The first time turned 18 and was eligible to vote, I go to vote within my own home community in Acoma. And I walk in and it's full of our elders from our community. And every young person that walked in, they would chair and go, woo, let's show you what you have to do. They walk you over and they talk to you about what does it mean? Here's the ballot and who's who. And it didn't dawn on me until much later, again, as I'm working through my studies and learning more, that wow, the reason why they were so enthused was because they remember this time that they didn't have that right. And my grandfather, literally until his death, was active in, again, political causes at home, making sure he was there every time voting day was there, manning the polls. So that still resonates with me too. Termination. Again, we mentioned this very briefly at the beginning. Termination was the next policy right after World War II. And despite the fact that so many of our population participated, not to mention code talkers across from 16 different tribes, including Navajo Nation, turned the tide in the war. When we came back, we didn't have voting rights. And then the next policy was to try and terminate our tribes. What a thanks, right, for our participation. So over 109 tribes were terminated. And again, that jurisdiction was turned over to state governments. And we see that impact still today. Tribes who fought literally through the Trump era to be re-recognized. And at that time, we lost over 2.5 million acres of land during that brief period from 1953 to 1964, when that policy was terminated. And over 12,000 American Indians lost their tribal affiliation. And it was during this time frame that there was another attempt, much like, again, boarding school, to assimilate our population, called the Indian Relocation Act. And it moved adult Native Americans off reservation and into urban areas as an attempt to, again, get them employment, but more so to remove them from their communities, these young, viable, economically viable American Indians, and move them out of their homes and off into urban centers, often with little support. Another big scoop that happened was the Indian Adoption Project. And this was in 58 and 59, really brief period of time, but over 12,000 American Indian children were impacted. This was a collaboration between the U.S. Children's Bureau, the Child Welfare League of America, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And while officially, federally, they say only 395, those same religious groups that we noted in the boarding school era also jumped on this. And this is how we had over 12,000 American Indian children, again, removed once more from their communities and be placed in non-Indian homes to be raised. And the aftermath is why we have the Indian Child Welfare Act. Again, is that rule of law that had to be passed to protect our children from being placed outside of tribal communities, outside of their extended family, outside of our tribal environments. And now we're in this era, this present day self-determination, and it was marked by a law called the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975. And if you've ever worked in any of the federal systems that, again, oversee or provide support to tribal communities, you'll hear us refer to this as the ISDA, or you'll also hear us refer to this as the 638, right? And Dr. Donald Warren, if you know who Dr. Donald Warren is, he's a wonderful, again, public health professor right now with the Johns Hopkins. He talks about this mechanism of Public Law 638 as a verb. We 638 things, because this was the first time in US governmental rule that tribes were allowed through this law and policy to now take funds from the federal government and create our own programs. Because up until this time, under this rule, everything was governed by federal systems, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Indian Health Service. All of these departments oversaw our care, our healthcare, our education, our law enforcement, all of those avenues of government. So this was, again, the law that sets the stage for where we are now, and we're almost at 50 years of self-determination. We haven't been at this very long. We haven't been allowed to be at this for very long. And so we're working in these avenues to create programs and systems that fit our needs. But there's lots of catches with 638. You can contract or you can compact. Contract means that everything you create still has to look like the federal government. Compacting means you can create a system and a program that reflects you, your cultural values, your way of being, but it means the government has washed their hands of you and they no longer need to provide you any support. So lots of catches with them. Now, who are we now? 574 sovereign nations. And again, you'll see over the course of time, this number may shift as more tribes, again, are working through that federal recognition process. And a reminder that it's not granting sovereignty, it's recognizing sovereignty still exists. And we're a growing nation, again, thankfully, of indigenous people across the US. In the 2020 census, we've got 3.7 million people identify as American Indian and Alaska Natives alone, that make up about 1.1% of the US population. But 5.9 million more identify as American Indian and Alaska Natives in combination with another race like myself, bringing our total to about 2.9% of the overall US population. And in New Mexico, we actually make up about 12% now. So we're getting up there, hey? In part because we get around, hey? So 87% of us, though, reside off reservation in urban areas. And part of that goes back to that relocation policy, but it's also because we're going to talk about issues of access and equity here in a bit. So our population has been through all of these histories of trauma. Again, colonization, westward expansion, removal era policies, boarding school and assimilation. And then we saw, again, the more recent impacts of trauma. Again, our healthcare systems, our environmental activism, and even COVID creating traumas within our community. And we're still facing a number of issues today: missing and murdered Indigenous relatives across the United States, lateral trauma within our communities, lack of access to resources, mental health issues, substance abuse, disconnect, sexual assault, violence against women and children. All of these come into play in the present day, these patriarchal power systems that weren't ours to begin with. And so we're dealing with all of these issues and insecurities and challenges. And so this is when we're talking about confronting that trauma, not only that history of trauma, but the present day. And Dr. Braveheart, Pam and I have had the fortune again of working with her, talks about how history is literally up until this past minute. Thankfully, you didn't traumatize me, hey, in the last few minutes. But up until that point, that is history. And so we're going through these present day traumas as well. So let's segue into this, because we're going to talk about understanding the trauma. And what do we know about trauma? Well, trauma is defined by this event or series of events that is experienced as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and has lasting adverse effects on an individual's functioning. From that history, that really brief, super high level, barely touched on history, did any of that resonate with this definition? Yeah. When we think about those removals of children, land loss, environmental loss, right? Movement from homelands, That's definitely trauma. And the types of trauma that we're probably familiar with talking about in the work that we all do in social work are these types: physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, neglect or abandonment. But we also saw in this history removal, loss of children, loss of elders, loss of land, mobility restriction, traditional and cultural prohibition. That's a trauma. So Dr. Braveheart gave us this language to think about how this works and how this impacted our community. And we're grateful because we didn't have that language to understand this really until this time frame. So she coined this term historical trauma in relation to our community. Now, her work also is based off of the work of Rachel Yehuda, Dr. Rachel Yehuda, who worked with the Holocaust survivors and their children and grandchildren. But in thinking about our population, again, that massive group trauma that we've gone through is where this term comes into play. That cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations. And that's what we saw happening from colonization forward, was this massive group trauma against Indigenous populations. So when we have a trauma, what do? We have to learn how to cope with it. That trauma is impacting all parts of us, our biology, our emotional being, our social being, our spiritual being, even our neurological being, how we think and process information. And what we begin to see is that we develop coping skills, and we cope in many different ways. And so those coping skills that were developed by those children who were removed, those children later became parents. They had children. Their coping strategies could potentially have been passed on to how they interacted with their children. Their children became parents. Their coping mechanisms potentially became what and how they raised their children, those grandchildren, right? And I think about this even in my upbringing, in part because there were many things I didn't understand about the way my mother raised us, the way my grandmother interacted with us, in part because some of that came from their coping in that removal. So one of the things that my grandmother used to say was, you never say I love you, because you only use it when you really mean it and when you might lose someone. And I remember being a kid going, I'm not going anywhere. And then getting shipped off to boarding school, like, oh, okay, now I get it. But there were lots of things like that. We don't hug very much in our family because emotional connection like that was not encouraged in school systems. My mom still does the side hug. And then I have to go freak her out. But it's some of these coping skills and learned behaviors that get passed along. And what we see is that sometimes these are not always positive, and they begin to have impacts on our mental health and well-being. And we begin to have issues that look like substance use, suicidal ideation, drug use, right? Domestic violence, violent behaviors. But in truth, those are rooted here in this bottom part of historical trauma. All of these issues and things and challenges and traumas we've been through. But trauma by itself can create a cycle. And so we see this even with historical trauma, that it can get passed. So we might think about this as intergenerational trauma. So Hess and Main define intergenerational trauma as that process by which parents with unresolved trauma transmit this to their children. Okay. Often you hear intergenerational trauma equated with historical trauma. And yes, historical trauma can beget intergenerational trauma, but you can have intergenerational trauma without having historical trauma. Okay, so two very different things. But that transmission and passage is often what we see happening still within our communities. And this is what Dr. Braveheart defined as historical trauma response, that constellation of features related to that massive group trauma. Could be PTSD-like symptoms, keen on edge. We're checking for safety, having somatic symptoms, low self-esteem or victim identity, substance abuse, self-destructive behavior. And we can talk about this in relation to epigenetics because traumas, of course, and genetics can turn on or off markers, right? So beyond learned behaviors and passage of coping skills, positive and negative, we're also potentially at risk for epigenetic change because it's turning on and off those markers. And it begins to have those changes for our children and grandchildren. Now, nowadays, we hear this discussion about trauma in the broader US consciousness and in the work we all do in the field that we are in social work, psychology, psychiatry, mental health treatment. In this phrase of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And research has shown that no matter what population, no matter who you are, if you've had adverse childhood experiences, there's a likelihood, now not a defined destiny, but a likelihood that you could have impairment to your social development, your emotional development, your cognitive development. And because of that, you might have more risky health behaviors. You might have disease burden, disability happen. And we have the potential for early death. And it can influence a number of things from, again, mental health challenges, substance abuse, to even our weight, to, again, our smoking history, heart disease, because it all has an impact. There's a wonderful book, if you haven't read it yet, and I'm still working on it, it's called Inflamed. Take a look at it because it talks about trauma and the inflammation response within the body and epigenetics. It's a great book, and it really ties in with this ACEs theory. But when we think about ACEs and historical trauma, it's almost like populations who have had historical trauma come preloaded with trauma and trauma response, right? And we're also dealing with this, social conditions and local context. What does that mean? That's racism, discrimination, equity issues, access issues, right? Before we even think about the potential for having an adverse childhood experience, we're already dealing with these things. We're sitting in that before we even get into this space. And so when we think about ACEs, I want you to think about this. We gave a whole population of American Indians intentional ACEs. This is one school photo from Carlisle in 1884, one school year student body. Multiply that by now it's up to 523 governmental school systems across the US. Times multiple years, multiple classes, in thousands upon thousands upon thousands of children. We don't even know what the number is of those religious school systems. I was working with a group of lay Catholics, including the American Indian Catholic Schools Network, and they are working to identify the number of Catholic schools. And they've gone into the archives through Marquette that holds much of that information around Catholic school systems. And before I stepped off of the group, we were sitting at around 224 schools. And they're still working on it at this time. Okay, phew. Deep breaths, because we have a ways to go. But why this is important is we're setting this up for this next portion, and talking just a bit around health equity, because this is that second layer, right? That we were looking at in that ACEs bridge there of those local conditions. So health equity, where right now, many of us are focused on access, equitable access across systems for all populations, not equal access, equitable access. What do we need to meet our needs? And when we think about historical trauma, what we see is that potential. So Terrell writes how historical trauma can actually derail a population. And it can set us up for all of this trauma response. But we can't think about this without thinking about historical oppression, because these policies and these systems that have been created are inequitable in their entirety, right? And so McKinley and colleagues, including Charles Figley, who you may know from writing about compassion fatigue, suddenly has this interest in historical oppression, which I found really interesting. But he writes that the chronic, pervasive, and intergenerational experiences of oppression get normalized, right, across our communities. And that this oppression is part of that framework of trauma. So we think about equity here. We're all familiar with this. Versus equality, versus what reality is like for many of us, right? We are in this space here of we're starting in many spaces at deficits of resources. And I want to be really clear. Deficit of resources, not deficit people. Okay. We're not given access. So we're starting off already in the hole, essentially, across populations that may have some access and some have way more resources than they ever need, right? And lots of times in policy, they say, well, everybody just needs equal treatment. But that still doesn't give us, again, the resources that we need, right, to be involved. So equity means that we're giving the resources that we need. And as you can see here with this, it gives us a chance to see the game, right? But we're moving into this space of liberation, and I'm going to take you a step further here in just a minute, where we're beginning to tear down the barrier to begin with, to be able to have access to those social determinants of health. So social determinants of health, many of us again are in this space of working on, including helping to promote economic security, educational quality, stable housing, neighborhoods, physical environments, food security. All of these things have an impact on our day-to-day functioning and our day-to-day health. But there's a term called structural violence that says, but when these systems are set up inequitably, that is inherently violence against the body and against that population, because it's setting us up in that deficit again, purposely and intentionally. And that structural violence also looks at this historical timeline too. Where did these policies come from? What did this population go through? What did they experience? And how does it define that inequity happening? So here's some examples. Navajo Nation, the largest tribal population in the United States, or largest reservation in the United States. 30% of those homes still lack running water. 15,000 of those are still without electricity. I come from a community where we live, yes, on a mesa. So we have to haul our water. We have to haul wood still. We don't have electricity. We run off generators or otherwise in our, at least, traditional homeland space. In our more modern villages, that's different. But we even have homes there in my community that still have no access to running water. Grocery stores. For Navajo Nation, the size of West Virginia has only 13 grocery stores. So we talk about food deserts, right? Food deserts in our spaces. And you can see an example here of those 13 or so stores and even convenience stores that sell food. Now, I don't know about you, but I really don't like having my dinner come from the gas station. And if I did, it's not often the most healthy food, right? So it's setting us up for that added disease burden. Our population earns less, no matter if we're in urban environments or rural environments in comparison to the non-Hispanic white population. Our housing and our income still has disparities. 88% of tribal officials reported homelessness in 2017 as a major issue in overcrowding in our communities. Now, mind you, were multi-generational homes part of our original structure? Yes, but our homes also reflected the capacity to house those in ways that made sense for our population. And nowadays, housing, the way it's created, does not make sense for our population. In fact, when HUD came into many of our communities, it broke up those traditional home systems, compounds or otherwise. And so you saw families now being thrown together into subdivisions in manners that never related. Again, housing issues. 58 out of every 1,000 American Indian households lack complete plumbing, as opposed to 3 out of every 1,000 white households. Digital access, we saw this during COVID. How many of you had challenges potentially to connecting, right, over the internet during that time frame? Rough than 34% of our American Indian households, over a third, did not have access to high-speed internet. And educational attainment, the fact that you're sitting here today is a privilege, in part because for many of our tribal members, educational attainment is still an issue. And in New Mexico, tribes have had to sue the state of New Mexico for quality education. And there's a case that's still active called the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit. And we're still working with them to try and gain gains in our education in New Mexico. Housing issues, again, related to spaces of labor market availability, school proficiency, and even environmental health care access. So there's this term that you might hear about, get thrown about quite a bit, called the body politic. And it's a wonderful term in part because it talks about this interplay of all of these things that we've been discussing: historical trauma, trauma impact, equity and access, resource deficits, right? And how it plays out on us, our physical body. And so Nancy Shepard Hughes, who is a medical anthropologist, Dr. Nancy Shepard Hughes, who is at Berkeley, wrote a paper all the way back in believe the late 80s, actually, that talked about this and said sickness is not an isolated event. It's where all of these things come into play, where all of these issues, challenges, history, deficits come out. And our body is, in fact, a talkative social and political construction. And those 3 dimensions of our experience are not divided. Pathology and the backgrounds of poverty and social discrimination is both the overflowing effects of biopolitics and biopowers on our body. Policy, resource access, even those day-to-day politics that we get involved in have actual everyday impacts on our bodies. And we see that in our health. We fare worse than any other population health-wise. We're more likely to be uninsured. We have issues like, again, depression, at higher rates, suicidal ideation at higher rates. We even are still subjected to tuberculosis, a disease that was largely eradicated globally, yet we are still dealing with this in our population. Heart disease, cancer, and of course, diabetes, right? And it's because those powers are playing out on our everyday body. Those access issues are setting us up. But when we think about even healthcare systems, that inequity gets baked in. So this is a comparison of the federal healthcare systems like, again, Medicaid, Medicare, the VA. And if you see that little bar there, the Indian Health Service system. And this is a per capita expenditure comparison across federal systems of care, including the one created specifically for us. So for a long time, I remember working in tribal communities and again, even coming into work at IHS itself, being upset at IHS. Terrible care, traumatic care often. But I realized that sometimes it's actually not IHS's fault. It's the government's fault. Because it's never given us enough money to create a system that provides us care. And an example of that, I didn't put that slide in here, but I love to bring it up because in 2011, there was a work group that said for IHS, if we were to phase in full funding to meet the entirety of our need in Indian Health Service by the year 2020, so this is a 10-year plan, we would be sitting at $21 billion dedicated to our healthcare. We're at 2023 right now. What do you think our budget is? Who knows? Challenge, all I need is in the room. Hey. We're at right around 9 billion. And that was a big increase. We've been sitting at 4 and 5 for well over a decade or more. So are we ever going to see that 21 billion? Probably not. And it's going to continue to look like this in an equitable system. And even at that, IHS is still only available to 1 in 5 American Indians. And it's not a health insurance program, not portable. There's lots of issues with eligibility and accessing care. So all of these things collide because what happens is when issues come up like COVID, then these inequities come into play. COVID was a wonderful example of that. And Tremblay writes that COVID-19 was not a pandemic, it was a syndemic. And a syndemic is an epidemic that spreads synergistically, meaning they come together, they feed off of each other with pre-existing inequitable social conditions. Are we there as a population? Were we there as a population? Yes. Who got inordinately impacted by COVID? Our population, right off the bat, right? And so we saw that syndemic happen. So why is this important? Because we're talking about present day traumas. And our children, by and large, across the United States, suffer at the hands of COVID. Not necessarily by illness, but by loss, right? Isolation, mental health challenges, educational time frame loss, potential mistreatment, abuse. But more so, many lost parents and caregivers. And for our population, that rate is 1 in every 168 children, American Indian children, lost a parent or a caregiver. And New Mexico and Arizona are the 2 highest states with parental or caregiver loss. Our next nearest population, the African-American population, that number is one in every 300 and some odd people. So we've had a huge trauma for our youth happening right now. So this trauma is going to become their historical trauma, right? Because this is something that's happened for a whole population. But additionally, when we think about that impact of overall trauma, we see it starting to impact our population as a whole as well. This is CDC statistics on, again, life expectancy. And this does not include COVID-related data here. This was pre-COVID. But our population's life expectancy was already on the decline, including for the overall US, but more so for the American Indian population. So what this table means here is for a child, an American Indian child born today, their life expectancy is only 65. The likelihood that they'll live to the age of 65. Now, what age is retirement right now? Feels like 80, right? Yeah. They've moved it up to 67. Social Security, they're trying to move it even higher. We could work our entire lives and never attain those because we may not live that long. So these traumas, again, create these disease burdens, create these life expectancy issues, right? And this is how we begin to examine that trauma. Okay, so we've been sitting in, learning about trauma, confronting that trauma. We're understanding that trauma and understanding the impact of trauma. But now we're going to talk about how do we now move into the space of releasing the trauma and transcending that trauma. Well, this is where we talk about trauma-informed care, because we're not the only population with trauma, right? All populations, all individuals are at risk for trauma. And so SAMHSA began to take a look at this and create systems called trauma-informed care systems to help address that trauma, especially in the healthcare space, mental health, substance abuse treatment, healthcare industry. And really, all trauma-informed care really does at an organizational level is ask you to think about that person who is coming into your space and assuming this person must have had a trauma in their background. And the way I treat them, work with them, address them, welcome them, might either exacerbate that trauma, re-traumatize them, or can make us feel safe. And there's several principles to trauma-informed care: trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration, empowerment and choice, paying attention to these cultural, historical, and gender issues, and then creating safety. And each of these avenues here that have been laid out as the key principles for trauma-informed care are meant to, again, create safety, are meant to resist re-traumatization. Historical trauma-informed care, all we're asking you is to do this in the context of this population. What has happened to this population that you're working with? Are there specific historical issues, relationship issues with the systems that they're coming into that we need to be aware of? Like the federal government's interaction with tribal communities, right? Okay. So this is what we're looking at when we think about trauma and trauma-informed care. Now, all of this time, and I have to apologize, we have not touched on this. What is our view of health? What is our indigenous lens around this? And so we think about who are we as a people and how do we think about our health. If we had the ability to say, we've never been through all of this trauma, what would this look like? Well, it would be in this framework, and it still is. It's relational, right? These relationships that we establish even today. Collective, we speak as we. Familial, intergenerational, and it's anchored in our identity, our culture, our historical and traditional knowledge, language, ceremony, beliefs, our story, and art. And more importantly, it's tied to our land and our environment, and it's based in our core cultural values of what it means to take care of each other, right? What does that mean to be able to take care of everybody? How do I take care of everyone in my family? And more importantly, it's based in cultural perpetuity. We want our tribal communities to continue, our indigenous identity to continue, and health is part of that. That's how we get us there. So if we're working in this framework and working with populations across, of course, indigenous populations, across any population that has dealt with trauma, and again, with cultural populations, you often have heard these terms in how we work with populations. The first one was cultural awareness, saying you just need to be aware. There's other cultures. Cultural sensitivity, we're being careful in our language and our approaches. And then for a long time, we were in the space of cultural competence. And that word bugs me, but it assumes that we can learn enough about a population to be competent in the way we care for them as an outsider, but we will never be inside, right? Do we ever reach competence? No. Okay. So we made this shift into cultural humility, being open to learning in that space of lifetime learning. I'm never going to be in the space of competence, but I can be open to that. I can be respectful in my engagement. I can be, again, respectful in my approach. But cultural humility is still very much the one-to-one. Oops. Cultural safety is a concept that has come forward globally from an indigenous perspective. It has yet to be picked up here in the United States. But it was developed by a Maori nurse researcher. Her name was Ramsden. And she wrote as a healthcare worker in the field with her population. Again, remember, same histories of subjugation, colonization, boarding school history, assimilation policies they've went through, federal rule, right? Governmental impositions for their population, similar histories, similar structures. And what she wrote is that Maori people no longer accept that our world is a perspective. We're not a perspective. Oh, that's just your perspective of how you're treated. No, this is our reality. And it's a whole viable, legitimate reality. And this leads to question of choices in service delivery. So we're talking a little bit more about healthcare here. The data on Maori mortality and morbidity has made it quite clear. The health service has not ever been culturally safe for our people. Services have not been designed to fit the people. The people have been required to fit the service. Does that sound familiar? Okay. For our indigenous population, we're often crammed into these systems that were never created for us. Yes, they were created for us to engage in, but they didn't come from that worldview, right? They didn't come from that space of who we are. And they often were created in this trauma history with trauma intent and inequitable care. So this concept of cultural safety, again, is something that's really resonated, especially with me and the work that we're doing out in our communities in University of New Mexico, that safety is defined by those receiving the care. And cultural safety occurs when an environment is physically, emotionally, and spiritually safe, and where there's that recognition of and respect for that cultural identity, that history, and there's no challenge or denial of that individual's identity, who they are, or what they need. When we're in a culturally unsafe environment, it diminishes or demeans us. We find that quite often, right? So we want to be in this space of moving towards culturally safe care, in part because it also takes on a social justice stance, a health justice stance. So my social worker in the room, what's one of the major tenets of our profession? Social justice, right? Equitable justice, environmental justice, justice. It's inherently anti-racist in basis, and it creates safety and equity. So we think about it kind of like this. If we're moving beyond just that one-on-one interaction of cultural humility, we're working to create systems. Social workers think in systems, right? That's why I like this so much. Is how do we create equitable systems, just systems, and systems that are culturally relevant for us, right? And it becomes that underpinning for trauma-informed care, for historical trauma-informed care, and really sets that up to hit all things all together when we come from that space. And cultural safety creates safe care. Whenever anyone is coming in for any type of service, education, anything, housing, economic, in a culturally safe space, it creates that safety. And that can impact us for generations, can reverse that, can heal that historical trauma. And so cultural safety looks like this. Not only are we moving into this space and moving out from that reality, out from thinking about equality, even thinking about equity, into that justice and liberation, but we're actually moving towards inclusion. We're part of the game. We're not just tearing down the barrier. We are creating the systems that work for us from our perspective, inclusion. This is a wonderful adaptation by Dr. David Murphy, University of Plymouth, that I found, and I just love it because it speaks to this concept. Okay. As I mentioned, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, this concept of cultural safety has been picked up globally, not just in New Zealand where it originated, in Australia, but England, India, the UK, and they're creating systems of care, access, and equity and education based in cultural safety. This is a wonderful assessment tool for healthcare systems, and how do we create culturally safe models specifically for Indigenous populations? And when we're working with populations, how are we also attending to reciprocal accountability? Meaning, what are we giving back? What are we giving back to this community whose ideas and understanding and frameworks we're working to create in a system of care? What are we also giving back? That reciprocal accountability. And in this entirety of today here with you all, we've been walking through Dr. Braveheart's model. Confronting the trauma. We've spent some time there, right? Understanding the trauma. What happens when we are dealing with trauma? What does that history of trauma look like? And we've moved into the space of releasing the pain and transcending by also looking at other tools and frameworks like historical oppression and understanding what that looks like. Cultural safety and how we can utilize that as developing systems of care to move us in the space of transcendence. And when we think about trauma-informed care, just really quickly, there was a couple of R's. Again, recognizing trauma, responding to trauma, actively seeking to resist re-traumatization. There's one more, forget it. But when we think about the space of cultural safety too, we're challenging you to think about your own replenishment. What do you need to continue this work? And how are you consistently coming back and being reflective in your work and evaluating what you're doing? Am I on the right track? I did that earlier with Pam. Am I on the right track? No, this is long. Because our goal is to reverse this. Remember that ACEs slide here? We want to come to this wonderful example by Megan Rides at the Door, Dr. Megan Rides at the Door, the National Native Child Traumatic Stress Network, where if we have that ability to create intergenerational healing, then we have thriving and safe communities, positive childhood experiences, cultural identity development and affiliation, good cultural values and coping skills, wellness and balance, meaningful life, that cultural perpetuity. That's what our goal is. And our goal is to regenerate and regenerate our cultures, regenerate our communities, and draw on our resilience, because after all of that, we're still here. 4 generations of boarding school. I'm still standing here with you, right? Our populations have grown. We're still standing here with you. And so we're drawing on that. I want to just show a few really quick things. The Santa Fe Indian School, it's an active boarding school in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It was one of the original boarding schools established across the US. But they're completely and totally run now by the Pueblos in New Mexico. And this is their construction around education in working with our students. How do we highlight and recognize all those gifts of our Creator? What are our core traditional indigenous cultural values? And how does this operate in our traditional calendar to guide us? And they built an educational system with this framework in mind. And man, they're amazing. Just amazing youth. And when we think about resilience, this is what we're driving for. Look at those beautiful children, the beautiful adults and elders. That's our goal. To continue that. So my question to you is, how can you contribute? I hope that you are a partner in that with us. And for each and every one of us to work from that framework of culturally safe care, I challenge you to think about what can you do to do this. So thank you for letting me be with you today. We'll see you all. Lots of references and resources. If you want to do some good reading, they're all here for you. And do spend some time taking a look at, if you can, that Digital Resource Center at Carlisle. It's really eye-opening. And thank you so much. Long talk, I know. Thank you for holding in there with me.
Any questions from anybody out there in the audience? It's a lot of stuff that was covered going on there. Anybody?
As someone who has, I think, come to learn about American Indian and Alaska Native issues, culture, policies over time, kind of later in life, I feel like a lot of the perspectives that I tend to get focus on reservation life, on folks who live near or around reservations. But I know that so much of the number of American Indians today are in cities, are in other communities as well. Could you speak some to what it looks like for American Indians who are living in cities, in suburbs, to thrive and find cultural safety, and for providers in contexts where they might not necessarily be thinking, folks before me have histories and backgrounds with these stories, to have an extra eye out, or to ensure that that piece isn't lost, maybe.
That's what's so interesting about cultural safety, in part because when we really begin to think from that perspective, it does not necessarily mean that we have to learn all of these histories, right? All it's asking us to do is to, when that individual comes in, now it sounds like cultural humility for a minute, but to really think about our systems, approaches, and how we create safe care for everybody. What is this person coming in with? And this assumption that they're coming in with potential trauma history, potential relationship issues with the system of care, right? And how do we create systems that are welcoming and, again, are open? Now, for our urban population in particular, that's difficult, in part because these systems in the broader communities aren't set up specifically for indigenous populations. And so you see us a lot of times more moving into spaces where we can create community, like around urban Indian health centers and otherwise. But do those exist in every space that we're at? No. And so our challenge as providers is to think about, as we're establishing these healthcare systems or working in these healthcare systems, how do we create a safe space for everybody coming in? And assuming that they may have specific histories, they may have more broader histories, but we're trying to make this system safe and welcoming for each. But we do want to do our homework. And that's part of our challenge here today, is because a lot of these policies around our population aren't well known outside of the population itself. So when we have a better understanding, it's helpful. I recently trained a bunch of call takers that work with the 988 system, both in New Mexico and nationally. And my challenge was to figure out, how do I get them quote unquote culturally competent and then able to help, again, influence their work on crisis calls. So we talked about systems because I needed them to understand that as they're making these referrals, these systems of care aren't easy to navigate for our population. And just having some empathy for that and understanding of that and asking some questions along the way was incredibly helpful in those calls being more effective. Like, I'm going to refer you to this program for crisis response. Can you tell me how far is it from you? Because we were getting calls from crisis callers in our communities being referred 200, 300 miles away, and not understanding, or folks being told, well, I have IHS. Oh, okay, great. So you have coverage for the service. No. But even just those empathy pieces of understanding systems helps. So I do ask that if you are working with more specific populations, learn about that history, learn about if what you can, and learn about those systems of care too that they may run into. And our systems are complex, unfortunately, but you've got a lot of resources to call on, like Manasa here, Pam. But that's a good question, and it's a really complex question.
Any other questions?
You showed a slide with the disparity of different diseases with a cartoon outline of her figure. Where was the source of that?
That one was from, let me come back to that.
If you don't mind, I'll take a picture of it.
Sure, it's the Kaiser Family Foundation, I believe. And it was an updated version. They had one from 2015 or so. Let me pull that back up for you. My apologies. And,
Oh,
oh,
I think
there it
you
went.
passed it. There it is.
Oh, Families USA, my apologies. And it was Health Disparities, American Indian Infographic. And they do have these infographics for nearly all major ethnic populations. And you can find that on their site, familiesusa.org. And again, a great example of capturing those health disparities. Now, I will say from 2015 to this graphic that was released in 2018, our depression levels actually dropped. We were at 60%. Again, now we're at 37% more. So again, we're 37% more likely to have depression. We used to be at 60%. Is that a drop? Yes, but we're also seeing it go back up. I will tell you for our youth population in particular, especially in New Mexico, the American Indian rates for depression have stayed stagnant at around 30% for the last decade, or actually a decade and a half. We just continue to have issues with, again, depression and suicide across our tribal communities. And again, it's part of this trauma. But what we're really worried about now that we're quote unquote post-COVID, and although we're truly not post-COVID, is that again, exacerbated trauma from COVID and what that's going to look like for our population, because that data has not yet been crunched yet. Yeah. But again, great site to look at is Families USA. And of course, CDC, you can find a lot of information on health disparities at CDC. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. And thank you very much for this presentation. I'm wondering a little about working with individuals who have suffered with trauma and obviously would have historical trauma probably. Should we like broach it right away and acknowledge it and say this is there for you, or does it make it worse for them? Or, I mean, obviously we treat whatever individual trauma they have when it's safe to do so, but I mean, for some of these populations, it's not very safe in our society, in our modern America. So how do we deal with that sensitively?
I think it's really helpful to come back into this, and I'm going to pull this graphic up in here. In talking about that trauma that they're experiencing oftentimes has roots in historical trauma, because a lot of times we don't understand why that trauma happened. And it's not to say that trauma, historical trauma, is an excuse for that trauma transmission to another person, another generation, but it helps us understand that traumatized people often then create trauma, right? And trauma can beget trauma. So it helps us to understand that there's that potential maybe that someone else who created that trauma with you had trauma themselves. And again, it's not an excuse, but it helps to set the context of how people can either break that cycle or where that cycle has begun and what we can begin to do to address it. And I find by and large in the work that I've done clinically with families and with patients is when we begin to talk about this history of trauma or even just address the heat, have you ever heard of historical trauma? Talking about where it comes from, it really helps because for many of us in our communities, this is where it started. You know, I really can't say that prior to colonization, we didn't have trauma. We probably did, but we had mechanisms to take care of it, right? We had ways which our communities dealt with it, had accountability, right? Justice. This has been massive trauma without justice. And so that trauma begets trauma. I hope that helps a little bit. Mhm.
I have a very particular question for St. Louis. I know that you were a Booter alum, correct? No. Oh, dang it. Well, you were still cool. So,
Thank you.
You're welcome. so I find it interesting that moving to St. Louis, there's supposedly like 20,000 of us here, Native Americans, we used to have an urban Indian clinic closed in 2019. Due to the population being 20,000 in an area of like 3 million roughly, how feasible would you think it would be to reopen the clinic? Because this would be an opportunity for practicum students to go work there, because we're very limited on where we can work here. So I think this would be another opportunity. How feasible would you say that would be? Or
I would say it's feasible when you look at it as a grassroots effort. And the reason I'm saying that is because the Indian Health Service is who funds urban Indian health centers. And we know that despite the fact that, again, that latest census says around 87%, it waffles between 78% and 87% of our population is in urban areas. But the Indian Health Service only has 1% of its entire budget allocated by federal rules for urban Indian organizations and healthcare centers. And why I'm saying that is because if you look at it from a grassroots effort in creating a center based on community pulling together, you have a far greater likelihood of it happening than trying to get IHS to fund it. Okay. And unfortunately, I have worked in urban Indian centers that have come and gone and come back. But the ones that have come back have come from that communal base versus working with the federal government to either refund it. So I would challenge you all to think about that. How do you create community among that population and begin to think about how do we create a center? New York is a wonderful example of that. The American Indian Community House in New York, they closed right before COVID happened. And I was their telehealth provider for a number of years. Well, they reopened recently, but it was because of a communal effort to bring that back. And if you can do it in New York City, hey, you can do it in St. Louis. It just takes time. But it's a needed resource. And I think our populations across the US are really beginning to think about that. Instead of relying on IHS or the federal government, we're looking at how can we create our own centers. And we have to go that route. So at least in that space, we can create it for us by us, right? Great question. And I love your bag, by the way. It's a Michelle Loudon. Michelle Loudon's from the Pueblo of Acoma. Yeah.
Other questions?
Huh?
They're doing something similar in Oklahoma also with mental health as far as a community aspect with Native clinicians.
Yes.
And I also went to St. Kate's,
What? When did
same
you?
high school
What year?
back then. We can talk over dinner with my wife.
Like you came after. That's funny. This is a small world, right? Indian country is small.
Any other questions?
I swear I didn't know him, Pam. Yeah, I have blackmail.
Another thank you for our presenter today, please.
Thank you, everybody.
For anybody out there in Zoom land that, or anybody here for that matter, trying to get CEUs, please contact me. Also, please sign in if you haven't. It just helps us with continue to seek funding to bring presenters here as well. So, but thank you very much. And yes, we'll let you guys have the rest of your day. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Seriously, you went to say